Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Today, we are strapping in to examine one of the most complex and absolutely mandatory pieces of legislation that Congress passes every single year, the National Defense Authorization Act.
It's the big one. We're talking about the nearly $900 billion annual defense bill. It's the one piece of law that literally ensures the entire military, from the Army all the way to the Space Force, can, keep its lights on.
And that mandatory nature, that's the key here. Because Congress has to pass this bill, it doesn't just fund weapons and soldiers. It becomes this colossal legislative freight train.
Absolutely.
And it carries almost every policy idea imaginable. So our mission today isn't just to cover the budget numbers. It's really to explore why this must-pass bill is the vehicle for a stunning and, frankly, sometimes bizarre array of non-defense riders.
Okay, let's unpack this legislative monster.
When you look at the history of the NDAA, it's really morphed over time. It started out, of course, as a necessary way to authorize war efforts and military budgets.
Just the basics. Exactly. But over the decades, as political polarization grew and passing any other kind of regular legislation got harder and harder, the NDAA just became this indispensable machine for policies that would probably die in committee otherwise.
You're so right. It's the ultimate Christmas tree bill.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of ornaments, we're finding provisions today that cover everything from Navy acquisition reforms to national biodefense strategies and, yes, even highly controversial social mandates and specific fishing regulations. It's all in there.
So let's start where the bill legally begins, with the core mission. This thing authorizes funds for fiscal year 2026, procurement, readiness across all branches.
Right. And when you look at this section, you see the direct priorities for confronting modern threats. The biggest dollar amounts, they always focus on modernizing the force for, great power competition.
So what does that look like on paper? We see these really specific, highly detailed requirements. Take the Air Force. The bill mandates comprehensive roadmaps for the B-21 bomber program. And that includes classified annexes, detailing the exact force structure, where they'll be based, the timelines, everything.
And that focus on the future fight, it goes beyond just plans. It extends to intelligence too, right?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
The bill requires similar detailed roadmaps for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. So this isn't just Congress saying, buy more drones.
Wow.
It's them dictating how the military is going to collect and analyze information on a global scale.
What about the Navy? I saw a lot about unmanned vessels.
Yes, that's a clear signal that the Navy is all in on autonomous warfare. The NDAA actually modifies some previous limitations on their medium and large unmanned surface vessels. This is basically Congress clearing bureaucratic roadblocks so the Navy can build its robotic fleet faster.
And the Space Force, as the newest branch, is sort of getting its marching orders directly from this bill.
They are. It's fascinating to see Congress mandating the exact bureaucratic structure. They're requiring the establishment of a Space Force Special Operations Component Command.
And that's not just a suggestion.
Not at all. The bill demands a full funding profile, a timeline, specific milestones for getting to initial and then full operational capability. It's like they're engineering a new global command structure right there in the text.
Okay, so beyond the hardware, the R&D section seems to be pushing heavily into new territory, specifically biotech.
A major push. The legislation establishes a brand new biotechnology management office and requires the DoD to develop an overarching biotech strategy. And that's paired with efforts to enhance international biodefense capacity. I mean, that's huge for the future of warfare and, frankly, defense against global pandemics.
But there's another side of that coin, right? A defensive one.
Exactly. Counter-influence measures are embedded directly into the R&D funding. The bill severely limits grants or contracts from going to any university that has ties to a covered nation or foreign entity of concern.
That seems like a pretty direct response to fears about intellectual property theft. So who are these covered nations we're talking about?
The bill names them explicitly: the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and North Korea. And the prohibition is designed to be really comprehensive. It limits the use of names, likeness, resources from these entities by any DoD-funded research institution.
So Congress isn't just authorizing money. They're drawing a hard line around who can even participate in U.S. defense research. That seems to lead us right into acquisition reform.
It does. And this is one of those technical provisions that sounds like jargon, but is critically important for anyone in the defense industry. There's a big push for efficiency.
How so?
Well, it's a terminology change that signals a major strategic pivot. The bill gets rid of the term program executive officer. It's the person who oversaw one weapon, like one type of jet. And it replaces it with portfolio acquisition executive. This person manages a whole category of capability, like the entire ground combat system portfolio. The idea is to create more efficiency and modularity.
And speaking of modularity, the bill heavily promotes something called the Modular Open Systems Approach, or MOAS. For our listeners, why is MOSA a big deal?
MOSA is vital. It means the DoD is pushing for future weapons to use interchangeable, standardized components. Think of it like having USB ports for military hardware.
Ah.
It's meant to improve innovation, allow for faster tech upgrades, and really increase competition among contractors. It could potentially lower costs in the long run. It's a foundational change in how the military buys things.
So moving beyond the tanks and the jets, let's dive into military personnel and quality of life. This is where it's fascinating because the sheer size of this bill means Congress is legislating tiny details of a service member's daily life.
This is where the bill really hits home on a personal level. There were always these mandates aimed at increasing awareness and improving the calculation for the basic allowance for housing, or BAH.
Which is that critical, non-taxable stipend service members use for rent. But the formula for it has always been criticized for not keeping up with the market, right?
Exactly. So this bill tackles that. It requires the Pentagon to develop a new methodology for calculating BAH rates based on the number of bedrooms in a house, not just rank and location. For a junior enlisted family, that could be the difference between making rent and, really struggling.
And they're also looking at imminent danger pay areas. That gets right down to the risk assessment for troops deployed in volatile regions.
And for military families, the focus on support systems is huge, especially around childcare. The bill authorizes significant support for expanding early childcare options. It even includes a pilot program focused on recruiting and retaining employees for those child development centers.
We know that childcare is one of the biggest factors in retaining military families, so legislating a way to keep childcare workers is a direct line from personnel policy to actual military readiness.
It connects right to education, too. We see authorization of impact aid for children with severe disabilities. And crucially, the Department of Defense schools, DODEA, are being told to improve their special education management.
How so?
By standardizing training globally and reviewing their list of recognized disabilities to bring it up to date. It's an effort to make sure military kids who move constantly get consistent quality care no matter where they are.
Okay, now let's turn to the items that are, let's just say, politically charged, the social policy writers.
They are definitely still in there. The legislation includes a prohibition on considering race, sex, color, ethnicity, or religion in admissions decisions for the military service academies.
So West Point, Annapolis.
All of them. It's a direct reflection of the broader national debates over affirmative action, just applied very specifically to those institutions.
And there was a related provision on athletics at those academies.
Yes. An explicit prohibition on the participation of males in athletic programs designated for women or girls. This was one of those riders that lawmakers knew would be very difficult to strip out without putting the whole NDAA in jeopardy.
On healthcare, the bill also has some very specific restrictions.
It does. It restricts the performance of sex change surgeries using DoD funds. And it goes further, explicitly prohibiting the use of federal funds for anything related to human cloning, artificial womb technology, or international surrogacy. These are complex ethical issues now tied directly to the defense budget.
And here's a detail that just highlights the sheer breadth of this bill. A new pathway for cadets and midshipmen to play professional sports after graduation.
It seems like a minor thing, but it's a huge shift in policy. Previously, they were locked into active service right away. This allows for that individual career path, but with a catch.
What's the catch?
They have to repay the full cost of their education if they later become ineligible to return to active service. The military is still protecting its investment, but it's a pragmatic recognition of talent.
So in the next section, we see the NDAA stretch its legs completely, moving to policy that has, almost nothing to do with the day-to-day of the Pentagon.
This is where you really see Congress using the defense bill to challenge or preempt the executive branch. For instance, the bill blocks the Pentagon from reducing troop levels in Europe below 76,000.
That's a direct check on the president's power, right?
Yeah.
It forces the administration to come back to Congress for permission before making a big strategic move.
It's Congress reasserting its authority, absolutely. And it does the same thing with homeland security and immigration topics that are usually way outside the DoD's core mission.
How far does it reach into border operations?
Pretty far. It requires these comprehensive reports on DoD support for immigration enforcement, what aircraft are being used, the personnel, the estimated costs, even reports on any aliens held at DoD facilities.
But at the same time, it puts a wall up in another area.
It does. A specific prohibition on the Secretary of Defense developing any kind of voting technology. It's a measure clearly aimed at keeping the military out of civilian election infrastructure.
The NDAA also becomes this major geopolitical and economic tool. Title 7.7, for example, is literally called the Fight China Act of 2025.
And that title imposes sanctions, broad prohibitions on investments related to certain Chinese entities, even those operating here in the U.S. So Congress is using the defense bill to wage a kind of economic warfare.
But then you get these provisions that are almost comically specific, like micromanaging what's sold in the base grocery store.
Oh, absolutely. There's a flat-out prohibition on procurement and commissary sales of any seafood that originates or was processed in the People's Republic of China. That's trade protectionism, basically, wrapped in the language of supply chain security.
And sometimes the military gets tasked with these unique, decades-long environmental jobs.
The DoD has huge responsibilities for environmental cleanup, and this bill focuses heavily on PFAS, those toxic, forever chemicals. It requires extensive reporting on the funding and status of cleanup actions at military facilities.
But here's where it gets really wild and unexpected.
Yeah.
Deep-sea environmental work.
A bill that authorizes B-21 bombers is also dictating deep-sea environmental policy in the Pacific, yes. The NDAA mandates a study on the feasibility of removing oil from sunken World War II tankers and warships.
Like the one near Micronesia.
Exactly. The goal is to prevent ecological disasters from a war that ended 80 years ago. That is a profound stretch of the defense mandate.
And finally, it even reaches into civilian law enforcement, reauthorizing the Protect Our Children Act and support for officers in crisis. This just underscores how broad this vehicle is.
When policy that addresses child protection and mental health for police officers finds its permanent home in the defense bill, it tells you just how much our domestic policy now relies on the NDAA as the only guaranteed way to pass.
So finally, let's look at some of the most controversial writers and the unexpected battles they caused. We have to talk about the Reagan National Airport controversy.
Right. This provision, which was slipped into the bill, deals with military aircraft safety in some of the most congested airspace in the entire country, right over Washington, D.C. It creates a waiver.
A waiver for what?
It allows military aircraft to turn off their enhanced tracking software while flying missions through that airspace, if the military itself decides there's no risk to commercial planes.
So the military gets to decide if they're a risk, not the FAA.
Exactly. The risk is obvious. You have tons of planes at low altitudes on complex flight paths. That tracking software is a critical safety layer. And this lets the military self-certify its safety, not the actual safety experts.
The criticism was intense.
Visibly angry. The head of the National Transportation Safety Board, Jennifer Homendy, called it a safety whitewash. Bipartisan senators urged them to rewrite it, saying it flatly fails to make the skies safer.
Another major fight was about funding diversion-taking money meant for troops and using it elsewhere.
A report from Democratic lawmakers found the Pentagon had diverted at least $2 billion from its core missions to support immigration enforcement on the border. And this was done without specific congressional approval.
And what were the consequences of taking that $2 billion?
Real consequences that directly impact service members. It led to pausing or canceling key projects. We're talking about the construction of a pilot training facility, repairing schools for military kids, and, critically, fixing up military barracks.
Barracks that the Secretary of Defense himself had called a priority.
The very same. So that's the real cost when you use the defense budget as a piggy bank for other missions.
And lastly, one writer with very clear political and personal implications. New privacy protections for high-profile political figures.
This provision aims to protect what it calls at-risk individuals, and that group is defined broadly to include members of Congress, their staff, and their immediate families.
So what does it do?
It restricts the publication of their personal information, covered information, in public records, and requires businesses to remove it from the internet if they get a written request.
So why tuck that into the defense bill? Why not just pass a separate privacy law?
Because a standalone privacy law would face a lot of constitutional and First Amendment challenges. It's just always easier to pass things through the NDAA where they get less public debate. It's a clear legislative priority for congressional safety over public access.
We've covered everything from B-21 bombers and the Space Force to mandatory PFAS cleanup, sanctions on Chinese seafood, and standards for special education. It is so clear the NDAA is far more than a defense bill. It's a shadow mechanism for major domestic policy.
It really is. I mean, it's fundamentally morphed into a necessity bill, the one piece of legislation that must pass. The fact that this single bill has to cover buying bombers, setting up cyber warfare strategies, defining special ed for military kids, and determining when a former cadet can go pro.
Not to mention passing trade and privacy laws.
Exactly. It shows both the immense scope of Congress's ambition and maybe its reliance on this one single vehicle to pass anything difficult at all.
When you look at the sheer breadth of what this one bill manages, you realize that the most important decisions affecting your day-to-day life, even if you have no connection to the military, might be hidden inside this defense bill.
So the question for you, the listener, is this. Does packaging all of this disparate, sometimes conflicting policy from combat readiness to civilian privacy into one must-pass bill enhance our legislative efficiency? Or does it just force Congress to accept deeply controversial policies simply to keep the B-21 bombers flying?
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.